We did a coin toss for order, and I'm very grateful to have with us the first of our two Fireside Chat Conservative leadership candidates, Derek Sloan. Please welcome Derek Sloan out. Derek, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
It's good to see you. So obviously the event that you had anticipated being here tonight is a bit different, so we thank you very much for still being here in spite of all the changes. One of the reasons that the Independent Press Gallery was formed was to advocate for independent journalists to have a voice in this country. And I wanted to start off right there with you. Where do you see the big challenges being for press freedom and for freedom of speech?
Well, hey, that's a really good question, and I've been a very strong candidate on those issues, and I think that the Conservative Party has to lead from the federal level on free speech. And I've been very clear that bills like Bill C-16, which can compel you to use certain gender pronouns, for example, should be repealed. We can't have bills like that from the federal level when we claim to believe in free speech. So we need to be very clear on issues like that. When it comes to the press freedom and the inherent bias that's in certain media groups, I think it's great that we're seeing groups that have started recently or not so recently that are holding their own against organizations like the CBC that get tons of funding. And I'm glad to be here. I think that I've set a trend that says do not ignore conservative media. And that has been, some people in the Conservative Party don't speak to certain groups, and I've been very clear to speak to all kinds of groups, whether it's Rebel News or groups like yourself, and I've set a standard for other candidates as well. So I'm pleased to be here. On the topic of free speech, we have to do everything we can to defend it. And, I spoke about Bill C-16. There's also social media banning. And I've been the only candidate, to my knowledge, that's spoken about taking on the shadow banning and the censorship that we're seeing. And whether that's during elections, we've seen examples of Facebook blocking statements critical of Jagmeet Singh or critical of open borders. We need to take these guys head on. If they're going to claim to be a neutral platform, then they need to act like a neutral platform. And this is where free speech is at right now. We're talking about university campuses, and I've been clear that universities need to be objectively in favor of free speech to receive federal funding. And we need to be sure that we're pushing for federal funding on the cutting edge, and that means social media. That means it's something simple we can do is to criminalize doxing. And I was speaking with a couple of young conservatives in Montreal just last week, who I met with them at their apartment, and I said, "Hey, you guys want to have a picture together?" And they said, "Well, we'd love to, but that might identify where we live." And one of them had already been doxed by Antifa, believe it or not. Who again, I've said should be declared a terrorist organization, but they had been doxed, and in this country, that's not a criminal offense. You can sue people civilly, but it's challenging. Other countries have made that a criminal offense, and I believe if you are trying to release details of where someone lives or details about where their kids go to school or go to daycare for the intent of having other people cause you trouble, that should be a criminal offense. So I think we need to hit this head on.
When you talk about, on one hand, though, wanting to push for more free speech on social media platforms, there are those that would, and let's take people's children out of the equation, there are those that would say doxing is a logical extension of online free speech.
Well, I think when the intent of sharing your address and your location with a group of people who, the intent is to cause you problems. Mm-hmm. The intent is, hey, Andrew, if you have this opinion, I'm going to tell my followers here where you live, where your kids go to school. This isn't about arguing political opinions. This is with the intent of people with bad intent showing up at your home. Basically, the intent is to shut you up. The intent is to scare you into not sharing your opinion.
But legislating intent, isn't that the backbone? A lot of these other areas of law, like human rights code, speech laws, other things that conservatives are typically against, when you start to get into the thought behind an act as fundamentally changing the nature of the act itself.
Well, I mean, criminal law is filled with intent, right? You have mens rea, and you have most criminal laws have to do with intent, not all of them. So I believe it's perfectly fine to target a behavior which has basically malice as its intent. So, the typical attack on free speech is, I don't like your opinion. Your opinion is violent. But if you are, for instance, free speech doesn't cover me threatening you. Mm-hmm. It doesn't cover me asking someone to assault you. And doxing is basically in that category. So if you're doxing someone, if you're putting out someone's intimate details of what they do and where they go, this has nothing to do with furthering public discourse. This has to do with targeting you and trying to silence you. And so to me, I think that's a legitimate distinction.
And on the regulation of social media companies, I guess there are two aspects to this. Number one is the effectiveness when these companies are such a size that they have the GDP of many countries, and most of them are not domiciled or headquartered in Canada. So how do you enforce a Canadian law on these companies without being like China, which is, restricting access? And the other part is the fundamental nature of, is it not challenging their right as a private company to operate the way they want, even if that means we don't think conservative speech is as valuable as liberal speech or something like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good question, and I'm not here to tell you the answer is easy. There's obviously different parts of this that would play into provincial jurisdiction. So the point is that we need to identify that it's a problem, and that's probably the most important thing. But listen, I believe that organizations need to follow the law in Canada, and there's all kinds of things that businesses can and can't do. And I believe that social media companies, which again enjoy the benefits of, they are not subject to being sued for example, libel or things of that nature. So at the same time, a publishing organization like a newspaper can be. So if they're claiming the benefit of sort of a neutral platform and for everybody to use for whatever the reason, they can at the same time edit comments without any rationale. They can't be removing certain comments unless it accords with a very open standard of conduct. And we all know that the codes of conduct on these things are really, in many cases, unintelligible. So
really what you're describing there cuts to what we've seen a lot of as of late, which is cancel culture and this idea that conservatives have expressed, which is that their voices are not valued by the elites. And we see that in social media companies. You see it in the mainstream media. You've experienced yourself a fair bit of pushback from the mainstream media, not just on social conservative issues, which I suspect we'll get to later on in this discussion, but even your approach to some issues that have been very pertinent throughout the coronavirus pandemic, such as wanting Theresa Tam, the public health officer of Canada, fired. We know from the last election, from all of Stephen Harper's elections, conservatives are not dealt a fair hand by the mainstream media. And I think that on the cultural side, we can talk about media bias and all of these things. But if you're within those parameters, you're operating as a figure in Canadian politics, you know the treatments the media is going to give you is not going to be good. How do you push back against that when you are, as you note, a conservative without apology, a hardliner on a lot of social and economic issues?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is you don't jump through their hoops. And so there's been, we get a lot of requests from mainstream media that we just ignore. And it has nothing to do with, it has nothing to do with those organizations, but it has to do with the fight that we're in. And right now, our fight is to win this leadership battle. So there's some candidates who bask in the glory of, sitting down with CBC and all this stuff. If I don't think that sitting down with a particular media outlet is going to help me reach conservative members, I don't even bother going on. So part of it is just not jumping through the hoops that the media has. And in a general election, obviously, the strategy is different. But the other thing, too, we have to remember is that we have access to social media. And we can drive our narrative through controversy or not using social media. So I think that my experience anyways is that there's some conservatives who feel that they've done a good day's work when the media isn't slamming them. And to me, I say, listen, if the media isn't slamming you, maybe you're not doing a good day's work. If you're going to stand on conservative principles in this day and age, you're going to get kickback. And sometimes we need to be able to stand there and take it and say, you know what, we've said the right thing. We don't need to apologize. We don't need to rephrase what we're trying to say. And let the media do what they want. I believe at the end of the day, if we push our message, whether through controversy or not, the Canadian populace will see through it. And I think that, especially with the use of social media, we can get our message through regardless of what the mainstream media says. And I've seen that happen in my campaign.
I think the saying that there's a lot of truth to is that Twitter is not real life. And when you go and knock on doors, most of the people that you encounter, regardless of where it is in Canada, aren't following hashtag CDN Poly on Twitter. They don't know what the Laurentian elite types, the mainstream media, are talking about. A lot of people still know what is on the front page of the paper, what's on their 6 o'clock newscast. And if you've got the mainstream media throwing every name of the book at you, how are you going to expand the base of the conservative movement and the base of the conservative voters if you're the leader?
Well, you know, the point you make about Twitter is correct, but it's incorrect when it comes to Facebook. And we're seeing a massive use of Facebook. I forget the stats, it's 80-90% of like everybody, even like grandmothers that are on Facebook. So I think that social media can be used to our advantage. When it comes to Twitter, you obviously don't look at your combination of positives versus negatives because it's only, politically engaged people that are there. But I believe that you stick to your narrative and people will eventually come around. And I saw that with some of the comments I made about Dr. Tam. Initially some people thought it was the end of the world, but even to this day, I still get mail at my constituency office from just random people who say, you know what, thanks for speaking out on this issue. You've proven yourself to be correct. So I think that we have to be okay with maybe being a little bit early or stepping out on a limb, and the truth will take care of itself. And I think that the media, as biased as it is, eventually the truth will come out, and I think that we have to count on it.
You had MPs in your own caucus that, after you had called for Theresa Tam to be fired, wanted you kicked out of caucus in the middle of a leadership race. And you can talk about people's motivations for that, whether they may have had an allegiance to another leadership campaign, but still, there have been people that have spoken up that have said they do not see themselves being able to serve under a Derek Sloan-led caucus. And you can say they're wrong, you can say that they're perhaps having a narrow view of it. But even so, if you are a leader, how do you unite that when you've got people that don't even want you to just not win, but don't even want you in the caucus? How do you serve and unify a caucus like that?
Some people think the party is about the caucus. The party is about the members. We all serve at the leisure of the members. If I am given the honor of leading this party, it will be because of the members. And so the caucus, it's up to the caucus to recognize and respect the members who put them there to begin with and elected the leader that they want to lead the party. So I firmly believe that the caucus will fall behind anyone who is elected. But at the end of the day, there is this attitude that it's about the caucus and, we're in Ottawa and we're important. We're not important. It's the people that put us there, and that's why I'm here, and I will never betray them.
You can say that the members put the caucus there, and if you're successful, the members will have put you there, and that is accurate. But even so, leadership is about unifying rather than dividing. So I'm not accusing you of dividing, but you have divided people against you, whether it's by your fault or not. So even if you say the caucus isn't the be-all and end-all, what's your approach going to be as leader with these people? Because you still will have to manage them. Caucus management is still a part of the role of leader of the Conservative Party.
Well, it's interesting because I've been very clear that I believe that votes should be free in caucus. So for people who don't agree with me on certain things, I'm not sitting here saying I want to twist their arm. Again, their mandate is to do what they feel their constituents elected them to do. So I have no problem with a caucus member voting according to their conscience, even if it's a different conscience than I have. But I do believe that this leadership race is exposing certain fault lines in the party. And, when you move from a place, when you're moving, from A to B or from a good place to a better place, it's never easy. I mean, if it was easy, then everybody would do it. But improving, moving to a place where we can become the dominant political force in this country takes certain risks. It takes stepping on certain toes, and it's an inevitable outcome of being able to win. And so I'm not surprised that this has happened, but I'm not concerned. Everyone loves a winner, and I've experienced this before. People say all kinds of things about you before you win, and then when you win, they're your best friends. So we'll let that sort itself out. Conservative
campaigns have historically been about aversion to risk, as you've seen. And I think a focus on, we heard the term throughout the Harper years of boutique tax credits and focus solely on pocketbook issues. I know that you've put forward a vision that deals with economic, fiscal issues, social issues, foreign policy. Do you fundamentally disagree with that idea that when you're asking Canadians to vote for you, to vote for your party, that the economics are where it's at?
Well, okay, so let me put it, so yes, I guess I disagree with all of it, but in a more nuanced way than how you phrased it.
Please, how do you phrase it?
Well, here, so I definitely disagree with running on a platform of boutique tax credits. However you run, it needs to be in a big, bold vision, and not, hey, Andrew, if you put your kid in soccer, I'll save you $200. Like in this last election, we had people literally okay, I'm going to save 25% of my cell phone if I vote Liberal. I'm going to get $100 if I put in green lights or environmentally efficient lights. So it can't be about that. It has to be about values. And I've said, listen, we need to run on a freedom platform. In the BC debate, we saw a poll that was done online from people all over BC, and I feel that they reflect Conservatives across Canada. And they were asked, what's the most important issue to you? And the economy was asked, debt was asked. These are things that they are important. I mean, we see a third of $1 trillion in debt, and yet 60-some-odd% of people said free speech. The economy was like 8%, 9%. So does that mean that Conservatives don't care about the economy? It does not. But the point is that our meta-narrative, I mean, Justin Trudeau does not campaign on the economy. He campaigns on his version of Canadian values, of his version of bringing the country together. He campaigns from the heart, or at least he tries to. And we have to do the same, because that's what Canadians, at the end of the day, Canadians are going to follow someone who campaigns from the heart. And so when we campaign on freedom, all of that impacts the free market. It impacts the economy. It impacts all these things. But we need to have a meta-narrative that drives our vision, and freedom is what that needs to be.
On the economics, because we can't get through a Conservative leadership fireside chat without talking about those, anyone who inherits the premiership of Canada, if they win an election after winning leadership, is going to have a very challenging economic situation to deal with, a deficit nearing $350 billion, debt that continues to go up. How do you deliver that Conservative vision that you want, which is tax cuts, lower regulations, less government spending, when that's the mess you'll have? What's the budget that you'll put forward, or the economic platform that you'll be putting forward?
Well, we have to do all that, and we have to drive the narrative. So, the idea that
I'm not asking about the narrative, though. I'm asking about the numbers.
Well, so we have to put forward a budget that cuts federal spending, period, right? But when it comes to the economy as well, we have to look at growth as much as we have to look at cutting. So getting our energy sector back on track is a major way of doing that. I mean, every job in the oil field impacts many other jobs in Ontario and elsewhere, whether it be manufacturing or banking or even legal work. So the energy sector is a big thing. We have to look at real tax cuts. We have to look at promoting made in Canada, small business here in Canada. And I have some good ideas of how to deal with that as well. But, to do all these things, we have to put Canada's sovereignty first. And I don't believe that we can get a recovery in the energy sector without getting out of the Paris Agreement. And I think it's very clear that we recognize as Conservatives we shouldn't be in these agreements that don't do us any good and hurt our own industries. So we do have to do that, but there's also regulations that need to be cut. We need to do what we would have liked to do anyways, but now we have a real reason to do it with this debt that we have. And we need to be very focused and brave in how we do that.
On regulations, your platform calls for a significant reduction in regulations. You talk about not just looking at federal ones, but even using federal authority to reduce provincial and municipal regulations. Now, I'm all for getting rid of regulations, but how on earth do you justify being a Conservative that respects other levels of government if you're wanting to start cutting their own regulations of those other levels of government?
Well, again, I don't think we would literally be doing it for them, but we need to get into a culture in Canada where we encourage.
Sorry to interrupt. Your platform says you would use federal authority to reduce regulations at all three levels of government. What does that mean?
Well, again, what we have to do when we're discussing regulations is we need to make sure, and I think that we're in a good place right now with the premiers of the provinces to offer them certain things from the federal government in exchange for compliance with reducing regulatory oversight. And I think that if the federal government champions a move like this, I think that we can get buy-in. And I don't like to I'm a carrot type of guy as opposed to a stick type of guy, and I think that it's in our best interest to have the best economy we can have, and I think that we can work with provinces and municipalities. I mean, as someone who has 19 municipalities in his riding, along with a reserve as well, there is all kinds of infrastructure funding that comes from the feds. So again, there's all kinds of ways that we can work with our municipalities, work with our provincial partners to encourage this type of streamlining.
And you've pushed, I believe, for 2 in and 1 out on regulations, right? Where
That's correct.
For every one that comes in, you're going to get rid of 2. What are the specific regulations that you see as being disruptive to business? The specific ones that if you're in there as Prime Minister, theoretically, after winning the leadership, have to go?
Well, listen, I'll give you a couple of examples, and maybe we'll just use those as examples. So I think we can, when it comes to paperwork for small businesses, we can put all of that into one portal. So, and hopefully we could even combine federal and provincial paperwork as well into one portal. So that would be one example of something we can do. I've also said, and this again would be to work in conjunction with provinces, we need to look at ways to be more innovative in our funding. So when it comes to entrepreneurship, which again is something that's very important, and innovation to growing our economy, we need to look at more sophisticated ways of allowing small startups to get money. And often the securities regulations that we have butt up against things like crowdfunding and things like that. So we need to work with our provincial partners to make it easier to get funding to small business ideas, because the Business Development Bank of Canada, these things, they're not geared for the small startup funding that we need, and we lose a lot of these ideas to the States where the capital markets are more developed. So we need to be a little more creative on these types of things.
And when you talk about funding, you're not talking about government funding. You're talking about even accessing private sector funding.
So crowdfunding by people who. So crowdfunding is a great way to get quote unquote investment for your business. But the way it's set up right now, there's no way to really offer an equity stake in your business unless you go through the rigmarole of securities laws, which requires more money and expertise than a lot of small people would want to do. But it is a great way in a small town or with the environment we have with the internet right now to find people online who like what you're doing. Maybe you're starting some sort of a craft company. They could invest in your business. And again, this is something that would need to be done in conjunction with the provinces. But I'm saying there are ways to make, for example, crowdfunding more accessible to Canadians to allow them to get businesses off the ground.
You mentioned earlier about Made in Canada, which is a part of your platform as well, pushing for labeling and identification of products that are made here. Certainly throughout the pandemic, I think we've seen the risks of having such a reliance on other countries for supply, in recent cases on personal protective equipment. But even so, we are a country that is based on free trade. The Conservative government in particular inked numerous trade agreements with countries all around the world. We had recently the renegotiation of NAFTA, which is now the USMCA, I think, or the CMUSA. They changed the letters around. But when you come out and say we need to make a push for Made in Canada, are you talking about protectionism, or are you just talking about promoting that culture of homegrown goods?
Yeah, so I think it's about promoting the culture. And I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which free trade doesn't even happen within Canada, between the provinces.
That's true.
So I mean, there's a great place to start. But I do believe that, and a key to this, of course, is reasonable energy prices. And we saw with the Green Energy Act, with Kathleen Wynne, our electricity prices increased by about 70%, driving all kinds of manufacturing business out of the province. And they're trying to do that again, by the way. Jerry Butts is in a new organization that's suggesting $50 billion for resilient recovery. Well, God help us if that's the type of recovery that we have. But in any event, with affordable energy, which is fossil fuels, and not subsidizing green energy, which is what we had done before, we can get to the place where we can reduce costs for manufacturing. Reducing regulatory overload, again, is another thing. Still, at the end of the day, we won't be competing directly on a cost basis, but I believe we can compete on a quality basis. And we've seen that happen with success in places like Germany. And I believe a lot of Canadians just want to know. I mean, I hear all the time, hey, I wanted to buy something made in Canada. I couldn't even find it, But I think if we do, in different provinces, Alberta has their own system. I don't care if it's a provincial or a federal one, but we need to let people know where products come from. I think Canadians are primed to buy made in Canada just by virtue of wanting to, and we need to give them the option to do that.
So under your ideal scenario, would there be a rollback of some of the agreements that have made it possible to freely trade in goods from everywhere and imaginable around the world?
Well, we need to evaluate all the agreements that we have. I'm certainly not against free trade. When we're trading with countries like China, I don't call that free trade. I mean, we have a country there that's devaluing their currency. They're using predatory pricing tactics. They're often trying to steal intellectual property. So we have to be very careful that we're not opening ourselves up to theft. So I believe in trading with countries that want to trade with us and want to play fair, and I don't care where they are. They could be in any part of the world. But we also have to be safe when we're dealing with countries that are acting in a predatory nature.
Let's talk about national unity here, which is a big problem, not just from Quebec, which has always had its troubles with the Canadian Confederation experience, also Alberta, Saskatchewan, parts of British Columbia, people who feel that the West is not a part of Confederation anymore, people who completely want to separate, or at the very least, people who feel like they're getting a raw deal. I know you have said you are a federalist, you don't want to entertain Alberta separation, but you will still, as a Conservative leader, and if your plan works according to how you want it to as Prime Minister, the growing discontent and discord with the West and with Quebec as well. So what's your vision to keep Canada together?
Well, you and I were at an event where a lot of people in the room, this was in Calgary, are on the separatist track. And, I spoke to them, and they seemed to like what I had to say. I don't know if everyone is not a separatist now, probably not. But, it starts with recognizing that, repealing Bills C-69 and C-48 is not enough to quell Western separatist sentiment. It's much more than that. These are feelings and issues that go back decades, if not generations. And I think recognizing that is a very important part. I hope Alberta, like other provinces, bargains hard. I hope that the leadership of any province puts their own province first, obviously with a mind to Confederation, but I hope that Alberta stands for their rights, and I've encouraged them to do that. But I also think that we need to do more than simply repeal a few bills that Justin Trudeau has brought in. We need to look seriously at the way that equalization works. And I'm not here to tell you the exact way that should be done, but we have to make sure that we have something in place that Alberta feels is fair. We have to, on the very base of it, we have to make sure that the representation in the House of Commons is adjusted quickly enough to accord to the changing population levels in BC and Alberta. And we know that BC and Alberta are underrepresented in relation to even Ontario and certainly Quebec when it comes to numbers of representatives in the House of Commons. Alberta should have right now probably about 39 or 40 if it was on the same ratio as Ontario, which is about 4 or 5 more than they do now. So these are things that we must look at. We have to put every option on the table. Andrew, I think you and I know that separatist sentiment is so serious right now. I don't think people in the rest of the country get it. I get it. I've been in rooms with hundreds of people who are so serious about this, and people like me out there. I mean, I've had there's many people who say, "Listen, Derek, if you don't win this, I'm out of here." And I think that the number one priority for a Conservative leader, for a Prime Minister, is making sure that every part of the country feels like an equal partner in Confederation. And I don't care what it takes. I'll make sure that happens with Alberta.
One of the big issues that we heard in the 2017 Conservative leadership race, which was odd to become so central, was supply management. And this is an issue where I think Conservatives have often philosophically been at odds with some of the political realities. And I know you have farmers in your riding. I know a lot of farmers, including dairy farmers specifically, make up the Conservative base. What's your stance?
Well, I think that when you look at, so first I'll say I don't have any intentions to make any major changes to supply management, although we can always look at ways to modify the system. When it comes to dairy, every country has heavy subsidies for their dairy industry. And we have farmers right now that have millions of dollars of property built up into the system. So I don't think that there's any easy way to solve the system. I think that when it comes to food security, when it comes to our farmers, we need to make sure that they're getting the help that they need. I mean, these are industries where when you have a bad season, you may be wiped out. And it doesn't necessarily fit the immediate constructs that you would see in an economics textbook. That farmer is done. Now, maybe someone else can buy his stuff or whatever, but we need to keep our farmers from going there in the first place. So when it comes to food and when it comes to things like this, I'm okay as conservatives making sure that doesn't happen. So obviously we believe in free trade, we believe in all this type of stuff, but when countries like China are attacking our canola farmers and things like that, we have to step in and defend them. And when it comes to supply management, listen, it's not a perfect system, but again, we live in a marketplace where other countries are basically subsidizing their industries to the same or greater degree, at least in this case. And again, it's not a perfect scenario. The subsidy is not undertaken by the government, it's basically on the consumer. So whoever is purchasing these things is the one that's bearing the cost of it, which again, not perfect, but it is better than a generic subsidy that we all pay for.
How do we as a country then make ourselves competitive when we're, in many cases, engaged in a race to the bottom with other countries that don't have the moral qualms with subsidizing relentlessly, flooding the market, in many cases flooding the market with product that is inadequate? How do you make yourselves competitive in a global marketplace in those circumstances?
Well, again, I think you just can't be afraid to say, listen, if that's what you're going to do, you're not having free access to our market. So again, I don't think, I certainly have no qualms in saying, listen, we will trade with countries that play by the rules. And we're not going to be giving free access to our market to countries that are actively undermining our own economies. So again, I think it's fair, and I'm not afraid to say we can make that distinction.
What would you say has been the most eye-opening experience of this campaign? And I ask that because it's been a very different campaign than everyone thought when they got into the race, more Zoom calls and all of those sorts of things than actual debates. When you came in, did you have a different vision for what you thought you were going to be hearing from people than what you actually did?
Well, there's so much centered around COVID, which obviously nobody expected, and that's very interesting. Obviously, I've seen firsthand the fault lines that have been exposed in the party. Really, I've been surprised. It's so interesting. If we would focus on a few different issues, I think we could easily win in an election. And there's a big concern right now in Canada with certain values issues and Canadian sovereignty issues and civil liberties issues. I don't know if I'm just a unique candidate, but one of the biggest questions I get right now, or I used to get, everyone knows what I think now, is, are you in favor of mandatory COVID vaccines? What do you think of, mandatory masks and things like this? I would have assumed some people would have been concerned about that, but literally the most frequent question I get, it's not about abortion, it's not about anything like that, it's about mandatory vaccinations. So I think these kind of civil liberties issues, Canadian sovereignty issues when it comes to UN agreements that we've signed on to, and even values issues, these are such important issues, and I don't see many of the other candidates really focusing on that very much.
Do you think there is an opportunity in Canada to push for a bit more of a political approach to appointing judges? This is something that we often hear about in the United States. In Canada, we've seen Conservatives be on the losing end of Supreme Court cases on key issues of conscience. Is that something, as a lawyer, as a leadership candidate, that you've taken an eye to?
Well, we have to do everything we can when we're in power to appoint good conservative judges. And when I say conservative, I don't mean that they vote conservative. I mean that they use conservative principles when they're interpreting the Constitution, when they're interpreting the law. And what we see is judges that take, an activist, I want to impose, my version of, utopia or whatever it is. They don't say this, but they're very activist in terms of their approach. Whereas the conservative, small c conservative approach to judicial application is, well, what does the law say? What has the court said before? Whether I like it or not, how do we apply it? And everyone here, even the average Canadian, thinks that that's how it's done anyways, and you and I know that that's not how it works. But we need to get, people in there, originalists, as it were, to borrow language that's used down south a lot, that, interpret the laws that we have as they're written and stop trying to rewrite things for the benefit of their own political agenda. So really, conservative judges apply the law whether they like it or not. And I think that that's really unpolitical, but unfortunately not what we see typically.
Now, of course, we invited you to participate in a debate, which we didn't get to give you, but we will give you a closing statement if you'd like as we wind things down and give people that final pitch for why they should vote for you as the ballot deadline nears.
Sure. Well, I'm the only candidate that has been so clear on some of those 3 points that I mentioned earlier. I'm dead set against mandatory vaccinations for COVID or anything. I'm against mandatory masks. I'm against the Paris Agreement. I'm the only candidate who's been talking about this. I'm against these other UN agreements that we've signed on to. I've been the only candidate that says we need to defund the World Health Organization. I've been the only candidate that says we need to defund these radical green energy organizations. I've been dead set on being against green energy subsidies, and I will always put Canada first. Everybody knows that I'm upfront, and what you see is what you get, and I will never compromise on our conservative values. Thank you, God bless, and God bless Canada.
Well, thank you very much, Derek Sloan, for coming. I know that 50% of the field didn't, so we appreciate that you did, and we thank you to your team as well for making this happen.